Welcome to the Maya Dynamics Rigid Body and Soft Body Simulation Training Kit. This series of lessons is going to explore what makes up a rigid body, how you use rigid body simulations, as well as how to use constraints. Then we'll explore how to use soft bodies, tweak out soft bodies for your creatures and characters, and use them in your own productions. Let's take a look here. I've got a fresh shelf here. I'm just going to throw off all these buttons so it's nice and clean. And let's open up a file called Active Passive. Alright, I've got just some normal objects here. I've got a plane, a cube, and a torus. Alright, and what I'd like to do is make these simulate so they kind of just fall on their own. Now there's two things that we can do. We can make either an active rigid body, okay, which I'll take this object here and make this active. Alright, so now when I hit play, nothing magical happens. That's because we don't have any forces acting on it. We did make it a rigid body. Okay, let me just minimize this, and you'll see here that all these new attributes have popped on it. We're going to explain some of these here in just a second. All these attributes popped on, but this thing didn't do anything. Well, let's connect this to a gravity field. Okay, I'll just move that up so we can select it quickly. Now watch. Okay, and it goes forever and ever until we run out of frames. Alright, so how can we have it react with the floor? Well, that's called a passive rigid body. Okay, so you can see what the differences are between the two. The active rigid body physically moves. The passive rigid body would be like the floor, or would be like a wall where you don't really want your objects to go past the wall. So now when I hit play, you notice we get a little bit of a bounce. Let's play this back. Alright. Well, let's take this little object here, this cube, and let's turn that into a passive rigid body. And you can see what we get here. Okay, and this is going to open up some discussion about what is connected and what all these attributes mean. But in a nutshell, that's how you can create a rigid body or a rigid body that's either active or passive. Now, there's a couple of things that I did not do. So let me delete that torus and bring another one back up. Alright, let's see. We'll just increase the radius a bit. And we'll let's create that. Alright, so I made that an active rigid body by going to active rigid body and then gravity. Well, you can also just add gravity or any of the fields. The system is smart enough to figure out that if you added a field, then it's probably going to be a active rigid body, or it's going to be an active rigid body. All right. Another thing that we could do is, look, we already have a gravity field out here. Why not just connect it right to it? Well, we could do that too. One of the things that it's important to do, and I haven't done it just so I can explain to you, is this needs to be zeroed out. Well, if I set these to 0, it's not very good, right, because it puts it back at the origin. But what I need to do is freeze the transformations. So I'm going to add this to my shelf. I'm going to go Modify, Freeze Transformations. And see how that zeroed everything out and set everything back to default? That's good. So now let's add this object to the gravity. The way we would do that is just go into your Window General Editors, Window Relationship Editors, and Dynamic Relationships. So we'll just select the torus and connect it to the gravity. Once you do that, the system will automatically add the rigid body solver to it. Okay, so there's a number of ways to go about this. Now, one thing that you can't do is animate the scale. And a lot of people are like, oh yeah, that's cool, I can just animate this scale. Let me set a keyframe for this. Okay, and I'm just going to go just a few frames, and I'll scale it up real thick and set another keyframe. Oh, my thing exploded. Let's see if we can get this to go here. See what's happening? the system is still figuring it out from here. It doesn't know once the scale has worked on it where these objects are and in relation to each other. So you have to be really careful. So let's dump this. Let's bring it back. Okay. And let's make this, again, an active rigid body with gravity. Test it. Alright, looks good. What if we took this object here and made it an active rigid body? Well, you can do that. You can switch these right over. And your channel box here at the very bottom is going to be active. Set a 1 for that. And now, you'll see, it too is being reacted upon. Now what's happening here? It hit it. How come it didn't fall down? Well, we never connected it to gravity. So what we'll want to do is select that object. We'll go back into our dynamic relationships and connect it to gravity. Okay. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to start to explore what some of these attributes do and how we can use them. All right, let's start off with the same file that we were working in Lesson 1 and take a look at some of the attributes. So I'm just going to open up that file and again set all these freeze transformations for all these objects. Okay, and I'll go ahead and add gravity to this. I'll make the floor a passive rigid body, and I'll make this a passive rigid body for now too. Alright, so pretty standard simulation. Okay. Now let's take a look at what these attributes mean. Now we have initial velocity and we have initial spin. Alright. Now think of this as how it's already in motion. So if I give this an initial velocity of 1, it's not going to keep pushing forward in x direction in 1. It's just going to have that little umph. Okay, let me make that 10 so you can really see it. All right, let me make a bigger floor here. See how it's not continuously moving forward? That's the difference between initial velocity. Okay, let me rewind that here. That's the difference between initial velocity and impulse. So if I put this impulse to 10, watch what happens. It gets shot off. One thing that you'll notice is there's a lot of fun to be had with dynamics. See how it just, no matter what, the system is pushing forward in this direction. So that's the difference between the initial velocity and the impulse. Okay, impulse, think of it like a rocket engine. It keeps going in that direction no matter what. This pushes it in this direction and then it lets go. As soon as that pushes over, this initial velocity, this initial push of 10, it starts it in this direction and then lets it fall. Alright, we can also do an initial push in a direction of rotation. So let's give it an initial spin of 10. Okay, let's try 180. Okay, and let's try a different direction. Let's try 50 for X. And let's try 180 again. There we go. Just to get it to spin over. And you can use these initial settings to really give it a little bit of lift, or let's get it up in the air. So maybe we're going to flip a coin. So let's get an initial. And how far did it go? Here it comes. Okay. So I think you get the idea of how you could use this within your own projects, right? Initial velocity is the first kick in that direction, or the first push in that direction. You got the same for spin. Now, you have a center of mass, and this is really cool because what we could do is alter the center of mass. So look where it is now. It's right here in the center. That's what that little crosshair does, okay? And so if I take this and let's say I move it in the X direction down towards the bottom here, okay, so if you can see very carefully, it's right there. Let's see how this alters the playback. See what's happening? Instead of trying to go flat, this is the center of mass, so it thinks all this is much lighter than this area. So it's trying to put that down on the ground. Okay, and you have a lot of control here. So you can alter that position, like I'm moving it out in Y. And let's rewind this back. See how it reacts? Okay, let me put that back to 10. So that's one thing you have to be careful of is if you start altering the center of mass, it's going to really affect the way this thing reacts and moves. So let me put this back. And off it goes. Okay, very cool. Next we have impulse, which I just showed you earlier. If I put, let's say, a negative 0.5 impulse, it's going to push this into the ground. And just keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing into the ground. If I go 0.5 in the opposite direction, just positive 0.5, it's going to lift it off and off it goes into space. Okay, and we can adjust that position. So if I want to, let's say, set an impulse of 1, which is going to be very strong, and I adjust that impulse position, I'm going to kick it off in a different direction. Okay, so instead of going center over, rotating over its center, I'm now forcing it to rotate around one of the ends here in X. And you can also give it a spin impulse. So let me take these impulses off, set it back down to where it was, but let me just give it a spin impulse in Y, so it's just spinning like a top. And you can see here, it's going to continue to spin. Now, what you could do is animate that. You know, it would be much similar to the initial velocity. You could animate it tapering off, but maybe you want it to last a little bit longer than an initial velocity. You want it to kind of keep going and then tear off. Well, that would be very useful to animate that setting. All right, in the next lesson, we'll talk about mass and dampening and some of these other options that we have here. We're going to continue looking at some of the attributes for rigid body simulations, and we're going to start off with mass. So right now we have a mass of 1. Okay, and let's just see how. We'll play this back one more time. And let's see, I think I have an impulse. Actually, we're going to take off this initial velocity. There we go. All right, so you can see how this plays back. Now, watch what happens when I change this to a mass from 1 to 100. See how it's trying to come to rest as soon as possible? This is a much heavier object, and it's a lot more mass. And we can also reduce the bounciness, right? We want it to be kind of like just a thunk, like a metal plate. So let's maybe make that 1,000 units of mass. Okay, so you can see how it's acting differently. Now, if I set this bounciness to 0, now we don't want any bounce. Okay, it's still not like a metal plate, right? If we had a metal weight from a gym, that's what this dampening is great for, right? The dampening is going to diminish the effects. If I put this like at 0.5, see how it didn't swing around? Let me set that back to 0 and play it again. See how here all the energy is still here. It's still moving forward. Well, if I dampen some of this energy, right, as it hits, some of that energy gets lost or dissipated, transferred if you're a physics major, and it's going to give this a little more realistic feel as you run the simulation. Okay, so dampening. Now if you dampen this too much, I just set this to 1. See, I didn't even swing around. It just hit and starts to lose energy as it falls down. So use that very sparingly, but do add a little bit to add some realism. Now, static friction and dynamic friction, people get these confused. Static friction is, see how this object is sitting here? That's at static friction. It's not moving, and it's the higher this value, the stickier this surface is going to be. Now, once this object starts moving, we're now in dynamic friction. Okay, so let's set this to 1 since we got it moving earlier. And I'm going to reduce my dampening to 0, and I'll just make my bounciness like 0.5. Let's give it some bounciness. Okay, now the surface is going to be very sticky, this dynamic friction. Alright, now let's see what this would have looked like with no friction. See how it's sliding on that surface? Okay, I'll set it back to 1 and we'll play this back. See how it doesn't really slide, it sticks. And that's really good, dynamic friction. Okay, we can also increase our static friction to 1, so once it hits rest, we're good. Okay, and you'll see here it's going to move, 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 and you see how it just keeps rocking? Well, we didn't have that problem when we had dynamic friction cranked up. Alright, so now if we wanted to rotate this floor, and let me just go to my solvers, interactive playback, let me add that to my shelf. That is a feature in version Maya 6, where we'll be able to now kind of rotate this floor. I want to show you static friction. If I set that to 1, what that's going to do for us. So here it's about to come to a rest, and now I'm going to lean this forward. And nope, it doesn't want to play back. Let's see. We'll animate that. Let's see about how many frames it takes. Alright, so I'm just going to set a keyframe for this floor. Go a few more frames. Keyframe that. Now let's play this back. So here we come. We're getting this to settle down. We do have a static friction of 1. See how it's not wanting to move? It's real sticky. That's good. That's what we want. So that's what static friction can do for you in your scenes when you have that cranked up to all the way to 1. Now, one option that we haven't talked about, and that a lot of people don't really catch on to, is the collision layer, right? And what you can do is group all of your simulations. Let's say you had another torus. Okay, I'll just duplicate this one. Move it over here. Okay, I need to connect it to gravity. Alright. And you notice it fell on that green object. Okay, and it reacted like we would want it to react. Well, what if we don't want it to react with the green object? We want it to pass through but hit the floor. Well, what you have to do is change this collision layer from 0 to something like 1. So now, it's going to go right through that object. The system doesn't recognize this object. But it went right through the floor, and that's not cool. Well, what we can do on the floor is set that to -1, which means react with all collisions. Okay? And that's how you can control how you want which item to collide with which other items. Okay, this can be beneficial because say you had a whole bunch of simulations going on over here, some over here, some over here. You can make yourself 3 different layer collisions, and then they're only going to try to simulate here. If you don't, what's going to happen is when it tries to calculate, it's going to calculate all of these objects, excuse me, and try to simulate all of them at once, and that's not very efficient at all. All right, collision layers. And again, you can reset these back to whatever you want. You can make those layers. Now I've got it reacting. All right, standalone. I'm sorry, stand-in. Let me set these back up to where they're about the same in position. Okay, I want to show you the difference. All right, so one's a little bit higher than the other. But I'm going to take this second one, I'm going to change the stand-in from none to cube. All right, now I want you to see how this reacts differently. What's happening is there is a make-believe cube surrounding this object. Why would this be useful? Well, it's going to be much faster. It only has 6 sides to have to calculate. Right? And once it's got those calculated, it's done. Whereas this, it's got all these little faces and triangles that it has to figure out. So if you have some objects way in the background that you could, live with looking like this, I say go for it. Use a stand-in object. It's going to be much faster. Now you can always change that stand-in to a sphere. Again, you're going to get some different results. So see how that is reacting. It would be really bad if you look at it from a side view. Okay, but if you had a sphere type object, maybe you had like a Christmas ornament with frills and beads and all this stuff hanging off of it, well, you could set that to sphere, and then it doesn't have to calculate all the little bits that make up that object. All right, I'll set this back to cube. Now, at any time, you can turn this into a passive object. Just take your active and set it to off. And that's it. We're done. So just that fast, you can turn those on and off. And the neat thing is you can keyframe that. So I'll keyframe this here. I'll go back a few frames, turn it off, keyframe it. And here, let's get ready to come on. So you can do some cool stuff. You can make little set-driven keys that go in and turn all those off, and really make some neat simulations where things are working just fine, and then all of a sudden parts fall off, and things are breaking off. Now we don't have any particles in the scene, but this is going to calculate will the particles actually move this. So let's play this back a little bit. Okay, I'm going to take off my initial spin here. So it should just sit there, just like that. All right. In the next lesson, I'm going to add to this lesson a particle, and we'll see if we can drive this object with a particle system. Now we'll take a look at one of the attributes on the rigid body simulation nodes, or the rigid body node, that is the particle interaction, and we're also going to add our first constraint, which is going to be a hinge constraint. So let's open up a file here. We're going to open up the particle constraints file, and it's a couple of little sprockets. And what I'd like to do is rotate one. Okay, so I'm just going to make this a active rigid body. I'm going to make this one also an active rigid body. Okay, and then I'm going to create a particle emitter, and let's just move this up and out of the way. All right. So let's shoot out some particles. And let's add a little bit of gravity to these particles so they shoot downwards. And what I'm going to do is select the particles, shift select this object, and choose Particles Make Collide. Now they first have to collide before anything else. Okay, so right now, here's what we got. Nothing major. So let's take a look now under this object's attributes here, and where it says particle collision, we'll turn that on. Now, it shot off because there's nothing in holding it in right? So the first time the particle hit it, off it shoots off. So now let's make a hinge constraint here. So again, we'll select the object, create hinge constraint. And I'm going to go in here to wireframe, take a look, and I can see there's a hinge going through this object. That's good. Okay, let's play this back. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now our little buddy here got shot off. So let's put a hinge constraint on him. Alright, let's take a look here. Alright, now you see how it just starts spinning like crazy? That's because both of these wheels actually have just a mass of 1. Well, that's nothing. So let's set that to 100. Okay, and we'll increase the dampening. There we go. A little more realistic. Well, let's say 0.8 for dampening. There we go. That way you can kind of keep spinning and moving. Pretty cool, huh? So if you think about it, you've got one thing driving another thing. And if I was to, really tweak this out and tighten up these teeth to where they interlocked a lot better, we'd have just a moving machine. And all of this is being driven by these particles. So you could have like a water wheel where you've got this water pushing this wheel, and that wheel is connected to something else, and it's then driving something else. And you can have a lot of fun with it. Now, it does not take into factor the amount of particles in there. I'm sure you could write an expression for that. Right now, it's just looking at the force that's being pressed down by those particles, and it then is pushing on this object. Now, we did use 2 hinge constraints, which if we take a look in wireframe, there is the hinge constraint. Okay, so if I was to rotate that hinge to something like this, it's going to throw off my simulation here because it's going to be rotating around in a different point. And I see here it's blocked. So something to just be aware of, that if you do alter the position of your hinge, then it will alter the playback simulation. So there we go. All right. So on that object, that is particle collisions on or off. Now I'm not going to get into lock the center of mass. That's a pretty simple attribute to understand, because what's going to happen is as I model this, like if I if I take and pull some of these vertices out or whatever, it's going to readjust and recalculate my center of mass every time I do modifications like that. If I turn that off, right? Here's the option down here. Lock center of mass on, then it's not going to take this into consideration. It's still going to lock it at the center of the mass. So, that's something that you might want to look at if you're working on a bunch of things. Now, ignore on and off. If I set that to ignore on, let me actually turn that on. Notice nothing happens now. And that's great. If you have like a ton of simulations and you've played them through and they look gorgeous, you're happy with them, go in there and turn them all to ignore off. Make a little set-driven key and drive them all on or off, or make a little script to turn all these attributes on or off. And that way, once you're happy with it, you're going to move much faster if you're only concentrating and playing back on the areas you really need to work on. And then you've got your, let me actually turn that back off. And then you've got your collisions on and off. So if we set these to not collide, as this goes through, it just goes right through these objects, right, with no regard for any of that. So something to keep in mind as you're working. And then you have multiple choices here on how you want to apply forces that are acting on it. The center of mass, the bounding box that's around the object, or the vertices or CVs. And each of these are going to give quite different results, in my opinion, because if you choose center of mass, it's going to apply that force right there to this little center of mass, and everything else is secondary. You know, whatever happens to the rest happens. If you choose bounding box, you automatically have each of those corners that it's going to affect, right? And if you choose vertices, that's where it's going to be the most accurate. Now, mind you, if we try to calculate every vertex on here, it's going to take forever. So keep that in mind as you're doing these simulations. That you know, usually center of mass is going to be fastest, then bounding box, and then vertices. It's going to be the most accurate, but it's going to be the slowest and hardest to render back, or hardest to calculate. Maya has a number of constraints that you can use on rigid body simulations. These constraints give you kind of pre-built definitions of how this object should react or how it should move based on the type of constraint. The first one that we're going to look at is a nail constraint. I love this constraint because it will allow the system to hold things in place, but you can also use them for something else. Let me show you. Alright, let's get ourselves a NURBS torus here. And this is going to be kind of like an inner tube. Okay, we'll freeze transformations, delete the history, and then I'll just give it a little bit of a rotate. Alright, let's add gravity, and let's hit play. Okay, it did exactly what you would expect it to do. It started falling down. But what if we wanted to keep this object right here? Well, what we could do is introduce a nail constraint. So let's go to the option box, and you'll see here that you have just a few options. If you turn this on, these become active. I'm not going to open up the option box anymore because I can do everything from the channel box after the fact. Alright, so let's hit play here, and you get just that. You get now an object that is sitting in space. So let me create just a quick little polygon sphere. And we'll just connect that to the gravity there. Relationship editors, dynamic relationships. And let's see what happens. You notice how the torus stayed there, right? It didn't fly off like we had earlier. Well, that's pretty cool. Let me actually delete this sphere. That's pretty cool. And there's a lot of things that we can do, including move this little handle here. Now that right there is the actual nail constraint. And by moving it, see how we have a connecting line from the constraint to the center of mass? Well, now when I hit play, it's going to allow the system to swing this object almost like a ball and socket joint. Right? It's going to allow it to swing around this nail constraint. So if it's in the center of mass, and let me go to my side view here. If I put this at the center of mass, my front view, like so, we're just going to get spinning. It's not going to be arcing all over the place. Okay, so you can use this for different things. Now you can animate this little guy right here. You sure could. One thing that I would recommend though is instead of animating the nail constraint, just make yourself a little poly object or a locator or something. Now, let me scale this down a bit. And let's add some quick little keyframes. And then just parent the nail constraint to this little control object. It makes life a lot easier. It's easier to grab this little thing, and if you wanted to, you know, animate that nail constraint going to different objects by constraints, you can do that too. So here we go. And there it is. Now, unfortunately, this thing will just keep spinning and spinning and spinning until we run out of frames. But one thing that you can do is on the object itself, remember that little attribute that we messed with earlier that was dampening? Well, let's introduce a little bit of dampening. So by setting that to 0.5, you see how this reacts much differently, and it settles into place much quicker. So Very useful for creating these types of effects. Let's open up a quick lesson called nail constraint. And you'll see here I've got a number of objects. First of all, I want to freeze transformations on all this stuff. Delete the history. Okay. And on these bricks, I'll make them all. We'll go up here. Create active rigid bodies. Yeah. And I'm going to go all the way down to the very bottom set of attributes. And I'm going to set this to be a stand-in of cubes. Why? Well, they're made of these little bricks, so I don't want all this stuff to inside to be calculated since that's really not going to react. Why not just treat the whole thing as a cube? Alright, so let's take this little wrecking ball and let's add gravity to it. And let's hit play. Alright, well, it kind of did what we thought it would do, but not really. Well, one of the things that's wrong with it is it doesn't have a constraint. It doesn't know to stay glued up here, so it just keeps falling. Let's add a nail constraint. And again, if we add a nail constraint, it's pretty much right there in the center, and it's figuring, well, I'm right here in the center, everything is good, no need to mess with it. Well, let's actually modify that and move it. Now, if you take a look, it's going to animate around the pivot point right here and hit these bricks. And so let's now move that pivot point. Okay, we got that pivot point, but wait a minute, we can't move this pivot point, the center of mass. Well, to move it, you actually have to go into this object itself. And there's the center of mass controls. So let's zero out X here. And let's move out this Z and Y to something like that. Okay. Now let's play this back. There we go. Now, if you wanted this little guy up here to animate, do like we did earlier, just take and parent the nail constraint icon to this little pivot icon, and we're good. Now, later on, I'm going to show you how to modify this to use a hinge constraint, which could also be useful. But if you wanted more movement as far as not in any particular axes, then a nail constraint's really useful for that type of work. The next constraint that we're going to talk about is the pin constraint. The pin constraint can be really useful for tying multiple rigid bodies together. So a very basic, quick review of how we could use this is, let's just take a couple of toruses here. And I'm going to just duplicate them. Okay, so we have 3 of them. And I'll take all 3 of them and connect gravity. Actually, I'll just take the 2 ends and connect gravity to them. Okay, so let's just play this back. Alright, very good. This middle one, I'll make it a passive rigid body. Okay, so it is going to be solved, but it's not going to go anywhere. And now what we'll do is we'll take these 2 objects, one's active, one's passive, and we'll create a pin constraint. And if we go into wireframe, you'll see that a line has been drawn between each center of gravity, or center of mass, and in between it's put this little hinge, and this little hinge looks similar to a nail constraint. So let's do the same over here between these 2, and let's play this back. And you can see they've slammed into each other. I think I still have this set up as a cube. No? Yeah. So let's set none for all these stand-ins here. Alright, so let's move this away just a little bit see how this plays, and you can see how now we're getting a much nicer simulation. And the neat thing is this passive, we can actually key and move it around. So let's okay, and these two, let's add a little bit of dampening. Just kind of slow them down a little bit. 0.4, let's try that. There we go. All right, so where would you use this? How would you use this? Let's say we have a creature, and I have a file here called animated bird, and it's got this little guy here, and he's just got a real simple hop, and he turns his head. Right, real simple. But let's turn on his necklace. So he's got himself a little bit of little jewelry here to kind of spruce him up a little bit. And let's take a look at the animation here. This little part moves, right? But this little jewel doesn't. So let's connect this together. All right, this little piece will make it, let me delete the history here. We're going to make it a passive rigid body. Okay, let's test this. All right, still works. It's very good. This little piece, let's freeze the transformations history, and let's add gravity to it. All right, drops just like we would expect. But now, between the two, let's create a pin constraint. Now, before I do this, okay, or I'll do it and then I'll show you why we're going to have to modify. Let's take a look at the center of mass. It's way down here. Well, if we wanted this to act correctly, we'd want the center of mass to be up here because we want it to act like it's tied to this necklace here. So let's play this back. You see how it's spinning? That doesn't look right. So let's delete that. Let's go in here, and I'm just going to isolate that object. Go into wireframe, and let's move the center of mass a bit. Alright, so there it is, this little X here. Okay, so in my side view here, I can make a little bit of a better determination of where we're at on it. Okay, and in my front view, we'll set it right on top, right up here. Alright, let's turn that view selected off. Now when I take the two objects and I make it a pin constraint, it's going to act a lot better. Alright, much nicer. However, there is a major problem here, and that's I've got this body, but that necklace isn't reacting to the body. Well, I don't want to make this whole body a active rigid body or a passive rigid body. Instead, let me select one of these faces here, and I'll go into Edit, Paint Selection Tool, and let me just go in here and select these faces. And so I just have, go to wireframe, might be easier to see. I just have these front faces selected. And let's go in here. So with those selected, let's go into Modeling, Edit Polygons, and we'll duplicate face. And we'll just delete the history. Alright, so let's play this back. That's what we get. So now, with that surface made, we'll just parent that to that object. Okay? So now it should move somewhat when that object moves. Okay? And now, back in Dynamics, we'll make that a passive rigid body. So you notice how now the necklace piece reacts accordingly. Okay? And all we have left to do on that little piece right there is just go into the render stats and turn all these off. Right? So now it won't render, and it's pretty much hidden from when we get into trying to render this guy out. And we have a good simulation here. Let me actually open up my range slider here. That way we'll just give it enough frames to kind of settle down. And you can see here how it reacts to his skin. And that's right, that's what we want it to do. So that's how you can use the pin constraint to create things like jewelry, a necklace, a weapon holder, something that's dangling, keychain, things that are dangling from your creature character, or even your set piece. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the hinge constraint. The hinge constraint is similar to the nail constraint. However, we get to define which axes we want the objects to pivot around. This can be so useful because you can create things like doors or two things that are linked together that maybe they're part of a convoy or a trailer on a truck, something like that. All right, to help you understand this, let's open up a file called hinge constraint. And there it is. And let's take a look at here. Everything is already set. I think we already have some animation on here. Okay, so let's connect this to gravity. Alright, and I think my object still thinks that I'm working with a stand-in, yeah. Alright, much better. Okay, so let's say we want this to only move in this axis. Well, earlier we used a nail constraint, but you saw when we first did the lesson with the torus that the object would spin around all over the place. Well, let's go up here and add a hinge constraint. And if you look, it's added right here in the center of the object. So let's just move this up here. Now let's take a look for a second at what this icon means and what it can do. Well, this is the bar. Think of this like a monkey bar or the hinge in a door. This is the axis that it will allow it to swing on. So if I hit play, and let's actually move this forward a little bit just so you can see how it works. So you see how it's swinging? It doesn't care how big or heavy that object is. It's only going to swing in that direction. And it'll settle down. But that's it. Well, how can we use this to our advantage? Well, let's put this back. And right now, if I hit play, not much is going to happen. It's going to sit there because there's no movement. However, if I rotate this little icon, so let's just go to my side view here, and we'll move this into position, about roughly there. We'll say 90 degrees. Alright, now let's play this back. Alright, so we get that movement, okay? However, if you look here, there's no swaying. And if you were to do this with the nail constraint, this bar would actually sway. Okay, so where can this be useful? Well, let's take a look at if we parent some of this together. So I'll parent the nail constraint to this object. Okay, I'll just hit P for parent. And then let's start off with some simulations. So let's start off with, or some keyframes, I'm sorry. We'll key it there. Then we'll key it to the side. Okay, and we'll see how this reacts our simulation. Notice how the ball does not go side to side as it sways. That's very, very useful. Okay, and you can create yourself bridge planks and all kinds of cool stuff like that. So let's take a look in the next lesson how to work with springs. The spring constraint can be very useful because you can use it just like a spring in real life. You can compress it and then charge it up, that way you can let it go, or you can attract other rigid bodies to a certain particular object that is a passive or rigid body. So what's useful about using springs is that you have something called a rest length and then your spring stiffness. So you can use these two things to control how you want the rigid bodies to move. Let me show you an example. Okay, we're just going to create some real simple objects here just so we can kind of get the understanding of these objects here. Alright. So I'll select both these, delete the history, and I will make this one right here a passive rigid body. Actually, I'll make both of them active just by adding a spring. Okay, let me show you what happens when they're both moving first, and then we'll go into some different modifications. Alright, it added a line between the two objects, between their two centers of masses. Okay, and it says constraint type spring. Now we have a couple of options here: spring stiffness, spring dampening, and rest length. Now by default, it calculates how far apart these two objects are, and that is the rest length. So if I hit play, nothing happens. But watch what happens if I move this object apart just a little bit. Now all of a sudden, this spring's rest length, the objects are further apart, which means, think of a rubber band, you've got it stretched right now. So when I hit play, the system is going to try and get this pair of objects back down to this rest length. Now you can see it's taking a long time and they keep undulating back and forth. Well, we can increase the stiffness, let's say by 10. See how it's trying to pull it in much faster? And now let's increase the dampening to like 0.8. See how quickly it comes to rest and then we're done. So that's if you want to move these objects apart, right? See how it pulls them together? Well, what if you pull this object closer together? See how they repel each other? Well, you could use that to your advantage. What if we take this rest length and make it just an even 10? Alright, so you see where I might be going with this. Let me take this object right here, and I'm going to take it from active to passive. Now you can see how we can shoot one of these objects off. So let me decrease that spring stiffness to 0.5 and show you the difference here. See how long it takes to get there? Okay, and I'll change this to 100. Okay, so this is a much stiffer spring. It's much stronger. It's going to get that object away from that or pull it closer as quickly as possible. Now your dampening is a huge factor in that, right? How much energy is lost as it's going through. So if I was to change this to 10, okay, see how it's not as stiff. Alright, so let's open up a lesson here. And it is called, let's see, spring constraint. This is the lesson name. And it's just a real simple object here. It's just a couple of little braces and then this little object. So what I want to do is take this object and I'm going to make sure everything is frozen over here. Add a spring constraint. Okay. And let's take a look at our constraint here. It's right in the center of mass. Well, when one object is selected, that's the center of mass. So if you look here, the rest length is 0, right? Not a whole bunch happening here. So let's move this down to the origin, and let's hit play. Alright, well, what's it doing? Well, it is taking our spring stiffness, let's set this to 10, and it's going to keep going until it gets it to rest at 0, because it's saying my rest length is null, right? It's a 0 rest length. Well, what if we set the rest length to something like 10? Now we can shoot this off in the air. Okay, so let's turn off our dampening. Give it a bunch of spring stiffness. Alright. Actually, let's introduce our dampening again so we can kind of wear it off. Alright, so I think you get an idea of what I'm going to do with this. Let's take these little guys here. Let's turn them into passive rigid bodies. Okay, I'm just going to reset this because they were acting like cubes when I was playing with them earlier. Now let's hit play. And as you can see here, we've got this thing kind of shooting off the D-band. Let's put this back in here. And we may actually need a few more of those because it's a lot of pressure. Okay, so now we've got this spring that's all charged up, ready to shoot out, and I'm holding it in with these two little braces. And if I wait long enough, we might see it try to slip out of here. Alright, so let's set some animation on these little guys here, since that's really what we want to set this off with, kind of like a little gun. So I'm just going to go in and add a rotational keyframe. Okay, and I'll go one more frame. And, oops. And we'll just let these loose. There we go. Now, it is spinning around, and it's kind of crazy. We could have modeled this with a couple of tracks and put some poles on the other side so it can only go in that one direction, which kind of would be a nice lesson if you want to try to do that on your own. Let me add just a quick little object in here. And just before I connect this to gravity, let me scale it up a bit. Freeze, delete, history, add this to gravity. And there we go. So not a lot of control here in my spring. It's more than likely it's probably because I have so much spring stiffness. And let's reduce this dampening. Okay, so we can see here that these two guys are moving at two different rates. So let's open up our graph editor real quick here. And let's just verify these numbers. So these are 158. And really the two x's are really all we're concerned about. So 158, let's make this 159. Okay, and let's see, this is going to be, let's say 25, and this one will be negative 25. So what I'm essentially doing is making sure that all of these little, both of those objects move at the same time, at the same rate. And something didn't happen there. Let's check our graph editor real quick. Oh, I don't think we want it to happen at 1,159, so we'll say 159 again. Okay, let's try this one more time. There we go. Much nicer. Let's play it one more time. We'll see our cube shoot off. There we go. And you can see it's trying to keep that rest length. So that's kind of cool if you think about it. Alright, and if you want, try to build the rails for this object. I'm going to actually build those in the next lesson, so if you want to take that, it's going to be kind of like a bonus. If you want to take that next lesson, please feel free to do so. If you don't, then move on to barrier constraint. Alright, let's create a couple of, or actually 4 different rails for our little launch pad here. And that's actually going to control the way that launch pad is going to move. It's also going to control when it hits, and it's actually going to give us a lot more force than just the spring pulling back on it, because it's actually going to slam into something. Alright, so real quick, I'm just going to go in and just make some quick little materials here, just so I can give these objects just a bit of color and make things a little bit easier to select. Okay, let's give this a new material. Let's pick a color here. Blue. And then we'll just leave those gray. Okay. So what I want to do is go ahead and model just a quick polygon object. I'm going to start off with a cube. Now let's go to my top view. And we're just going to put this at one of these corners. Like so. And we'll just take this vertex, pull it in like this. Okay, if you want, you can move these like this. Just what we're doing is we're creating a surface that this can kind of glide along. Alright, so let's go now into our side view. And we'll pull this up into position. And I'm just going to very simply just grab these vertices and move them up in the air. Now, with this, I'm almost done here. I mean, we're just making a simple little rail here. What I am going to do is go into my modeling mode, edit polygons, cut faces, and let me just activate that tool again. I'm going to click once and twice. And the reason for this is I just need some extra vertices here to hold the shape. Alright, back in my top view, let me grab these points right here. And you'll know exactly what I'm going to be doing here once I start pulling. I'm going to create a lip. Okay, so using those few points, I'm going to create a lip that's going to catch our object here. Okay, and I'm just going to pull this up real tight. Alright, looking at this in shaded mode, you can see that I've got this rail that it's going to slide along and then slam into this right here. So the bulk of the work is done. All I need to do now is duplicate this. So let's go back into my top view. Duplicate this and move it. And we'll just rotate this into position. Okay, we'll go ahead and duplicate that again. Like so. And one more. Alright, so now we're going to have these 4 rails that are going to act as stops for this object. Okay, so let's play this back. so we can see before, and you can see it's way past the stop or the spring length here. Alright, so let's take these guys, freeze, delete history, and turn them into dynamics, passive rigid bodies. So here we go. Now take a look at what we have. We'll be able to shoot that much higher. Okay, let's play that again. Alright, now we did have a little bit of penetration here, and a trick that you can do, because we don't really have a lot of faces on here, is we can go into the attribute editor, go to the rigid body node, and update this tessellation factor. So just give it a little more data for it to tessellate with. There we go. So pretty cool. Made a neat little launch pad for an object. The final constraint that we're going to look at is the barrier constraint. Now the barrier constraint has some good properties about it, but it also has some bad properties about it. What a barrier constraint does is creates an infinite plane that the object that's constrained to it cannot go past. So once it hits it, it's either going to stop, slide, keep going in that direction, but not go past the barrier. So let's open up a quick little example, or create a quick little example to show you how that works. Alright, so let's create a NURB sphere, and I'm going to add a barrier constraint. Now when you get this barrier constraint, this is what it looks like right here. Okay, it's just a little plane with a line coming out of it. Okay, let's add some gravity to this ball, and let's hit play. Now it did just what it would say it would do. It went to this plane. Let me just scale that up so it's a little bit easier for you to see. It went to this plane, and once it hit that plane, it stopped. Okay. Now we can put multiple constraints on here, so I can go up here and add another barrier constraint. Move that down. Now imagine here's a plane, and then it's going to intersect with this plane. Okay, and then be stuck in this little wedge there. Well, if you notice, it won't bounce, right? It sticks to the plane. And that can be good, that can be bad. What's bad about that is let's create a NURBS plane to kind of match what we've got going here. Let me go to my side view here, actually my front view. So I'm going to create a plane here that matches similar to what we have. Okay, I'll just duplicate this and move this also down here. Alright, both of these I'm going to freeze here and then turn them into passive rigid bodies. Okay, let me turn off my grid. And let me just assign a quick little material here so it's easier for you to see. Okay, and let me go ahead and create one more NURB sphere. I'll assign it a new material, and that way we can identify between the two what we've got going here. Load up the color palette, which takes just a second. Okay, and this one I'm just going to connect it to gravity. Alright, nothing major, but theoretically you would use these barriers instead of these planes, because that way we can control the way that that object is moving. It's like, I can't go past this plane, so why not use a barrier constraint? Well, here's the problem between the two of those. No bounce. Well, it's bouncing because it's hitting the plane. Let me actually move these down a bit. There we go. It's a good example there. What was happening was the center of mass for these objects were hitting those spheres. So let me see how this reacts differently. No bounce on these balls. Stick, stick, go. Now, mind you, it will move faster, right? It's going to solve much faster. But you lose some of that kind of realistic simulated feel from it. So use those barrier constraints wisely. If this was back in the foreground and I just want it to fall and not go through the floor, no problem. It's going to work like a champ. But if you want the bounce and whatnot, you're going to have to probably simulate or use a combination. The next two little features that I want to cover are the set active key and the set passive key. This will allow you to turn on and off your rigid body dynamics, but I think it's just as easy to go in and key them yourself. But let me show you where they are. Alright, so I've got this ground plane here, and I'm going to make that a passive rigid body. This little guy, I'm going to add gravity, and let's hit play. So it does what you would expect it to do. Well, what I'd like to do is set a key to turn off the rigid body simulation. Now you could go in here and just hit this button here and key it. However, you could also go up here and choose set active. Okay, we're on frame 23. Let's go to frame 24. And then we'll set a key for passive. And then we'll go a few more frames and we'll key it back on to active. So it just makes it a little bit easier to work with. You can see if you want to control your rigid bodies without having to scroll down and find this attribute, you can key it on and off using these two options. So it's totally up to you how you want to use these. If you prefer to use these or make these into shelf buttons and then activate them that way, then you can go in here and control them with these, either key it here or with these options. The core of the rigid body simulation is a rigid body solver. This is the attribute or node that is going to determine how these objects are moving in this space. Let's take a look at some of the attributes that we can work with. Alright, let's start off by opening the active passive file. And I'm just going to take everything and let me add my freeze transformations and delete history again to my shelf. Alright, I'm going to make both of these passive rigid bodies, and this one I'll just connect gravity. Alright, let's play this back. Alright, no problem. So let's take a look up here under solvers. We have this little panel here, and there's one called initial state. Now if you remember from the dynamics training kit for the particles, we used initial state quite a bit, because once we had the shape of the particles that we were after, we can start off from there. So let's say we want to start this simulation off after the first little touch. So this is where we want to start the simulation. Well, when I rewind, I'm back to here, okay? And I don't want to just set my first frame as 400 because that's not going to work. What we can do, though, is go up here to Set Initial State and choose Set for Selected. Now, if you want to set it for all, you can choose Set for All Dynamic, but I like to do it on a per object basis. Now, when I rewind and hit play, see where it starts from? Right here. So that can be really useful. The next option that we're going to talk about is the Rigid Body Solver. So let me just fire that open and close this little window. Now what do we have going on here? Well, the first attribute that you're going to notice is the step size. This is how many times per frame the system is going to check and solve the simulation. So if I set this down to like 0.01, it is going to calculate a lot of frames. It's in the same amount of frames, it's going to calculate 3 times as many calculations. Now this is going to slow it down, but it's going to make it a little more accurate. The next attribute is the collision tolerance. How accurate is this collision? Okay, so it did slow it down. Now, scale velocity, that's a really good attribute, especially if you're working with big set pieces. If your set pieces are really large, you should scale the velocity to match the object size, right? Because if you had, let's say, a penny and a manhole, right, they're going to react 2 totally different ways, to gravity, to the way they drop. Well, you'll want to adjust the scale velocity for each of those. Then you also have start time. So if I set this to 100 frames and hit rewind and play, you notice for the first 100 frames nothing happens, and then it takes over and simulates. Right? And this is going to tell you what frame you're currently on. Alright, in the next lesson I'm going to cover the different types of solver methods as well as the different states. Continuing with the rigid solver node, let's take a look at some of the different methods that are available to you. Alright, so we have, by default, it's the Runge-Kutta, I probably mispronounced that, Runge-Kutta Adaptive, which is going to be the most accurate solver that Maya has. So let's play this here. Alright, that looks pretty good. Now, the midpoint is the least accurate, however, the fastest. So keep that in mind as you're working on your projects, that you may need something that is going to solve much faster. You don't need it very accurate, and it'll get the job done for you. Now, this one in the middle, that's kind of a mix of speed and accuracy. So you're kind of in the middle there when it comes to how this is going to play back. All right. A couple of things that we want to talk about next are the different rigid solver states. All right, and I'm not going to get into all of these in too much detail, but the most important one is state. Because notice if I hit rewind and play, nothing's happening. If I turn state back on, there we go. It jumps up and it's ready to take part. So that's one quick way of making a global on-off. Right? You can also turn off friction and bounciness. You see how things just kind of slide, and this will continue to just slide because there is no friction settings now. Bounciness is overridden. Okay. Now you can turn off contact motion, which will not calculate either friction or bounciness of these objects. Okay. And you can turn on allow disconnection or contact data if you want to store that data. All right. I'm going to get into cache here in just a second because I'm going to show you up here how to actually turn that on too. You do have a few other things like display constraint. Remember earlier when we had the nail constraint and spring? This will actually turn on and off the little handles. Display center of mass, so you can turn that on or off. You notice that that's disappeared. There it is again, so pink X. You can also display velocities, which is kind of cool sometimes. It's got, you can see this little arrow poking out. So there you can see this arrow with the velocity direction that it's going in. And you also have display label, which will show you that this is active, this is a passive object, this is passive. Kind of helps for troubleshooting. All right, so that's basically the node solver, the rigid body solver node. Now, what I want to do in the next lesson is show you how to create new nodes, modify them, and then take your objects and connect them to different nodes. I'm going to show you now how to create a brand new rigid solver and then connect that to your objects. So then you've got multiple solvers that you can use, some with default low-res settings, some with high settings, and then at render time you can either cache out or create whatever type of simulation you want based off your different solvers. Alright, so we're going to continue with that real basic file. Rigid solver node is the name of the lesson file that I want you to create. And let's just turn these into passives. And these will just connect to gravity. And there we go. Okay, something very basic, very simple. Now, what we want to do though, and you just tear this panel off here, is let's take a look at our solver. I'm going to call this old. Okay, rigid solver old. That's going to be my adaptive 0.01. Let's say our collision tolerance is going to be 0.015. So extremely, let's say 3 for our scale. Extremely detailed, right? Now let's go down here to create new rigid body solver. Okay. So current rigid body, that's which one we're going to edit, the old or the new, and then we'll hit rigid body solver. So this one I'm going to rename rigid solver new. Okay. This one we can make a midpoint, maybe 0.8. We don't care how accurate it is, you know, to a point. Let's see. We don't want friction or bounciness. Well, let's play this back. Nothing's changed. We do have this brand new solver. However, the system is still connected, all of these, to the old solver. So to transfer all of these to the new solver, okay, here's the command. And you'll have to kind of take a look down here at the bottom of my screen. It's going to be rigid body, space E for edit, dash solver, which is, now it's going to ask us what solver do we want to connect it to. We're going to connect it to the rigid solver new. Now if you look, this automatically got updated to this new one. Now it's going to go right through this little green plank because the green one was not part of this solver. So what you could do is if you had like background elements and foreground elements, you can make two totally different solvers, connect the two solvers to their own, or the objects to their own solvers, and then you could turn on and off the different states. You could have the ones in the background just roughly simulate, the ones up front much more accurately simulate. And this is how you can get a whole scene of objects to simulate much faster than you would just trying to save everything at default. All right, let's select that object and add it to the new solver. Okay, using the same command. And if you use a command line, you can just press up on your keyboard and reuse it. Now let's add this to my shelf. Okay, so let's play this back now. Okay, very simple movement, very quick, very fast. All right, let's turn on our friction and bounciness. All right, let's just determine where they land. So take a look at these right here. Now I'm going to select all the objects and reset them back to the old. All right, and I can make this a shelf object. Now that's using the more accurate solver. You can see the difference of where it ended up and where it ended up with the old. But having these shelf buttons, I can now jump over to the new solver. Okay. Or I can rewind, drop back to the old solver. So pretty cool if you think about it. This is a way that you can really organize your rigid body solvers and make life a lot easier when you're working on bigger projects. All right, lastly, I want to talk briefly in this lesson about the set rigid body interpenetration and the collision. Very quickly, what that means is if I take this object and I choose it to be a rigid body interpenetration, oops. Now, it's going to go right through that object. Okay, two objects selected. So if I do that to these two and hit play, See how they go right through each other? Maybe you have like gaseous objects or things like that. Now if I want them to collide again, I just hit this set rigid body collision. Okay, so I would do the same for these two. And that's how you can quickly determine, do you want objects to collide or not, very fast. Finally, I want to talk about this memory caching. Okay, you can enable, disable, or delete. That's also right here in the node. So if I enable it, notice how this became active. And I can turn it on and off from here also. So just so you're aware that if you wanted to cache data, that's where you can cache the simulation. So that way, as you're playing them back, it'll play back a little bit faster. Remember, it is going to eat up some memory. So if you have a lot of memory in your system, go for it. That's really about it as far as rigid bodies are concerned. We are going to simulate and bake out these keyframes here in just a second. But as far as playing out the rest of these, I'm going to save the particle disk cache and this oversampling for the soft body lessons. The last thing that I want to cover as far as rigid bodies are concerned in the overview of rigid bodies is how to bake out the keyframes. One of the worst things that you can do is get a huge simulation started, run the simulation, and then try to render that simulation without actually baking out the keyframes. What we can do is use the power of Maya to create the animation and then go back and delete all of the nodes that have to do with the constraints, the gravity, the simulation, and then let the actual keyframe data run the animation. So then it's no longer simulated. Alright, let's open a quick little file here called Bake Simulation. And it's just a little tablet here. So I'll take this little object, this cup, and we'll make it passive. And this little guy, I'll connect gravity to it. And let's set some initial y in maybe 5, maybe negative 15. Let's see how this works. Okay, a little bit too much, a little overshoot there. Alright, we'll go ahead and give it a spin of 120. Here we go. So you can see how fast or how long it's taking to simulate. Okay, I'm going to do 200 frames here, and it's taking a little while to actually solve and simulate. Let's verify that I have this set to play every frame. There we go, much better. Alright, there's one problem here, and if you've noticed, I never scrub the timeline whenever I'm working with simulations, because watch. If I scrub forward, alright, at the end of 200 frames, look where this is, okay, and I'll go back. Now look where it is. Now look where it is. See how it's inconsistent? That's because it uses the frame before it and the frame after to solve how this movement works. Okay? And heaven forbid you go backwards or forwards. It's just not a good thing to do. However, if you're working with character animation or you're working with something where you do need to scrub back and forth, this can be kind of a tricky. Well, the solution is to bake out these keyframes. See all this data right here? Let's bake it out. So we'll go to Edit, Keys, Bake Simulation. And you can go to the option box if you want. You can choose all keyable or just, select these guys from the channel box. I prefer to do it that way. Right? And we'll sample by every frame. Bake it. It runs through real quick. And I can scrub back and forth. Okay. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and bake it with all keys so I can show you. Just reset this. Alright, so this is going to show you all of the keyframes. So here we go. Now, with one little tablet like this, That's a lot of keyframes. And if we take a look at our outliner, watch what happens as I delete some of these options here. Okay. So on the cylinder, I'll throw away the tablet has no node, no rigid node. The cup has no rigid node, no gravity. And then you have to make some decisions, like I don't need scale or visibility, so I can destroy those. Alright, so what I'm left with is, and I don't need visibility either, so I'll just break connections on that. All I need now is the translate and rotate, and those I'm going to tweak out a little bit too. Now if you look, these three do not get modified through the whole animation, so I can break those connections. Now I'm left with just three curves, or three attributes. The problem is when you bake a simulation, you go through every single frame and put all of these keyframes down for every frame. Let's take a look at our graph editor. If you look, that's lots and lots of keys. Okay, one for every frame. So what we'll do is we'll run a command called curves simplify curve. Take a look. Okay, take this, curves, simplify curve. Curves, simplify curve. So, and you can select all three and do it at once. I just wanted to show you individually. Now look what we've done. We've gotten rid of all the intermediate frames that we don't need, and we still have the same animation. Okay. And now I can scrub this back and forth, and it's going to be very, very reliable. There's no more simulation happening. If you're going to render out, or especially go to a render farm, I cannot stress to you how important it is to bake out your simulations, have all that data ready to go for the render farm, and then you're set. You're good to go. We're going to start exploring soft bodies now. And soft bodies mean lots of different things to lots of different people. Down to the core, soft body is nothing more than a surface that is being controlled by a particle cloud. So knowing that, and if you've gone through the particle training kit that we have, you'll quickly understand the power that you have at your fingertips when it comes to deforming surfaces and polygon objects using the power of particles. Alright, let's start by just creating a simple sphere. Okay, and let's take a look at the vertices. I'm going to change the background to black so it's a little bit easier to see. And let's turn off our grid. Alright, so as you can see, I have vertices on the outside of this sphere. Okay, and I will go ahead and create, let's say, a polygon cube also. Alright, and we'll look at the vertexes here. And these vertexes are right here on the ends, or the edges, the tips of where these edges meet. Okay, so those are the two things. Now, when I go to make these soft, okay, create soft body, option box, I'm just going to reset it and I'm going to leave everything alone. These right here are when you use these options, and I'll come back to those in just a second. Let's go ahead and hit create. And in the attribute editor, I'm going to actually select this particle cloud that we have now and change this from points to spheres. And I'll just reduce this down a little bit in size. Alright, I'm going to do the same for this. Okay, create soft. I'll change this to spheres. Okay, so let's take a look here. What's going on? Well, notice those spheres. Well, those spheres each represent a particle. Those particles each represent a CV or a vertex. So what we could do is take these particles and add something like, let's say, a turbulence. There's my turbulence field. I'll hit play, and let's actually increase the magnitude and decrease the attenuation down to like 5. Still not strong enough. Let's see. There we go. Alright, well, what's going on? Well, the system is simulating those particles being inside of that turbulence field. And because the particles are moving, so is the shape, or the object itself, the surface. Okay, so let's get rid of that object, or that field, and let's put in a radial field. Again, let's crank up the magnitude, and we'll turn attenuation off. Alright, now I'm guessing that we didn't have the particles selected. So let's go into the dynamic relationships, and let's connect it to that radial field. There we go. Okay, whoa, it just exploded there. Okay, let's set this magnitude back down. And we can see that radial field is now pushing that particle. Okay. So you can see how the fields are now creating and modifying our geometry. Now what's neat is if I wanted to hold this shape, I'm like, wow, that's a really cool shape. I can press Control D, duplicate it, move it off, and there we go. Maybe I want to make one like this, Control D, duplicate it. Now each of these have the particles on there, so I could, if I wanted to, go in and select the particles, maybe put a vortex on them. So let me crank up the magnitude on my vortex. And let's move it over a bit. So let's see, why aren't these guys connected here? We'll just open up the dynamic relationships and we'll connect. Well, we do have it connected here. Let's see, let's open up the outliner. Our vortex field, attenuation to 0, max distance 0. And let's see, let's turn on our shape here, because that's kind of what's happening is we don't see it. And let's see here on our particles. Oh, I know what's happening is we don't have up and downstream connections connected to it. So we do have a particle cloud, but the particle cloud really isn't connected to anything. Right here. Okay. So let's just dump all that right there. Alright, why would this be useful? What are we going to be able to do with this? Well, think of it like this. We're going to now be able to create things like jello, things like fat, things that are one step beyond just basic shapes. So let's first create a new polygon or NURB sphere. Scale it up a bit. Okay. And I'm going to go into Create Soft Body, Option Box, and take a second to explain some of these other options. Now, in the next lesson, I'll go through these, but what I want to do is make soft, okay, take my particle cloud, add gravity, and then create a polygon floor, or a NURBS floor. Alright, so what do you think is going to happen here? We want this object, let me just add a quick material. We want this object to interact with this floor. Okay, no problem. Hit play. Alright, well that didn't work. So your first inclination may be, well, I want to make this a passive rigid body. What happened? Right? It still went through. What's going on? Well, what's happening is that now we're dealing with particles. We're not necessarily dealing with rigid body and active rigid bodies, right? Passive and rigid bodies, passive and active rigid bodies. So what we want to do is select these particles, this floor, then in particles we're going to choose make collide. Now if you take a look, we're getting a little bit of a better simulation. Now our GeoConnector, so a lot of this is going back to the other training kit that we have. The GeoConnector is determining how resilient this is. So let's maybe modify that a bit. There it is. Okay, so let's reduce down the resilience a little bit. Now that's pretty cool, right? And it's neat to look at, but this is not really going to solve a lot of problems for us because right now it's a flat pancake. And when we started, it was a sphere. Well, if this had volume, right? Maybe if this was silk, sure. You know, the silk comes down, lays down, and it's done. But what if this was kind of like a rubbery ball, like a slimy rubber ball? Well, that would not be very fun to play with if it just flattened out like that. So in the next lesson, we're going to look at some of the options there of turning this into an object that still holds the volume and shape of the original. So now that you have an overview idea of soft bodies, now let's start digging deep into the soft body's biggest asset, which is goals. The use of goals and particles will help the particles stick to a certain shape or stick to a certain position. Well, this is going to be really useful because what we're going to do is take our object, simulate it using rigid body simulations, and then go back and make it soft. And you'll see this is just a really cool way to work. All right. Again, very simple setup here. We want a plane. Okay. We want a cube. Okay, and I'm going to animate this. So I'm going to connect this to gravity. And I'm going to make this one passive. So if I play this back, this is what I get. Okay, and oops, I made a NURBS cube. I want a polygon cube, just so I don't have all the different faces to deal with. All right, let's give this a quick little material here. Just something that's easier to see. All right, again, gravity. Okay, so nothing out of the ordinary, what you would expect, right? We have our animation set. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is make this jiggly, right? Like Jello or something similar to that. So what we'll do is go up here to soft rigid bodies, create soft body. Okay, we'll reset all this. And we're going to choose duplicate and make the copy soft. Well, what does that mean? Well, what we want to do is duplicate this object and then turn that copy into the one that is controlled by the particle clouds. Now, doing that alone isn't going to give us a lot of effect. Right? So if I rewind this and play, the particles really aren't going anywhere. Right? So let me undo that. All right. Instead, what I want to do is turn on make the non-soft object a goal. Right? And I'll just set this to a weight of 1. What does that mean? Well, what I want to happen is the original object, which is animated with the rigid body simulation, it's going to bounce around. I want it to be the goal. And the particle cloud is going to try its hardest to keep the shape of that goal. Right? And that's what this weight of 1 means. If I reduce this down to, let's say, 0.5, hit create and play, if you look very carefully, see that undulation? Well, that's because there's 2 things happening here. Let's go to wireframe. Might be easier to see there. See how that's undulating? And you're seeing 2 different colors? That's because you really are. Let me get it to where we can see here. You have 2 copies of this. So let's undo this one more time. Okay, we're back to just 1 object. All right. We'll go back in and make it soft. I just undid that. Okay. And what I'm going to do is come up here and turn on this hide non-soft object. So now, if you look, I've got a little bit of wiggle. Now, what can this be useful for? How can I use this, you're probably wondering. Well, let's take a look at our particle cloud here. We have, actually, in our channel box, it's easier to get to, a goal weight. So let's say 0.1 is our goal weight. See how this undulates? It's only 1% of trying to get to that shape. Here's 0.6. Okay. And what's really cool about this is that we can choose different parts of this to be a different amount of jiggle. So let's select this particle cloud here. Right click, you can choose particle, which is really cool. So now you can actually select each of these little particles on here. So let me actually adjust all these particles so they're spheres. There we go. Okay, so you see how I've got this one selected right here? Well, let's set the goal weight of all of these to 1. Easiest way to do that is the component editor. And just go all the way over to particles, and you'll see goal weight per particle is 1. Okay, perfect. Let's set the goal weight in the channel box to 1. So as long as this is set to 1, and then whatever we set in this particle attribute for the component editor will be the same. So if we set 1 here, it'll be 1 times the other one, that'll be 1. But what if we take this one little guy right there and set that to like 0.3? Watch how this jiggles. Isn't that cool? What if we set this one to 0.3? Let me go back to this particles tab. And let me get to where I can select my particle cloud. And we'll say 0.3 for that goal PP. So I have 2 of them now that are going to be jiggling. So you'll quickly realize that when you're working with these types of simulations, it's best to determine your animation first. So there we go. And that could be like a Jello cube. So once you have your animation set, then you go back and you make your object soft. All right. Next, we'll talk about how to use this exact same lesson right here and actually paint those weights right in. Next, we're going to explore the Paint Weights tool for the soft body simulation, and we're going to do this a number of different times. This is just on the cube that we were playing with earlier, the little Jello cube, and I'll show you some of the settings that you can set in the Paint Weights tool so you're actually seeing something a little more accurate than trying to guess. Alright, so one more time, let's take a look at our simulation here. Alright, so let's say we don't want to go to the attribute editor, or the component editor, but instead we want to paint the information on. So we can choose Paint Soft Body Weights tool, okay, and actually come right in here, and let's say we paint this a value of 1. Okay, so now when I play this back, we just have that one undulating point. So I'll just paint that one too. So let's go ahead and just stop this, and we'll flood the whole thing with 1. Okay, so now when I play this back, we're not going to get any modifications. So now if I wanted to, I can go in and paint like 0.45 each of these little corners. Well, how come this one's moving a lot more than this one? Well, it's very difficult to see how these are averaging out because the change is, you can't really see where this is and where it's not. Let me give you a little tip. Scroll all the way down to display. Okay, let's say 0.5 is going to be the lowest we're going to go. What you can do is go into display and set the minimum color to 0.5. So what happens is the lowest amount you want to go is now pure black. And then the maximum color is white. Just makes it so much easier when trying to modify some of these numbers. Okay, so let's hit smooth. We'll flood it once. Nice playback using the Paint Weights tool. So now, very quickly inside of this Paint Weights tool, you have Replace, which if you set a number, it will go in and just replace that number with that value. Okay, so that's 0 right there. All right, doing its own thing. If I change it to add, what that means is it will add 0.1, 0.9, or whatever it is every time I come by and click, okay, until I get it to the maximum. Okay, so that's add. Scale is going to allow me, let me drop that down a little bit, to adjust all those properties by that amount. Okay, and smooth will do just that, allow us to come in and smooth. Now an attribute or a tool function that I like to use a lot is this flood. So I like to hit that smooth button, hit flood a couple times, smooth things out, and you end up with a nice movement. Okay. So let me replace these with... Now if you need to make a bigger brush, hold down B, click and drag as you hold down the B on your keyboard. Let's smooth that once, play. Okay, and you can choose how much to smooth that by. So if you want, you can come in here and just paint that smooth factor in. So very useful. You'll be able to play with this quite a bit. And in the next lesson, we'll make a little curtain connected to a field and then play with some of the attributes with painting on the weights of our goal. So now we'll take a look at creating an animation of a curtain. We'll use some basic keyframing first. Then we'll go in and add some fields and go in and paint some weights. So let's start with the animation of just the curtain. Alright, let's open up the Paint Weights lesson here. And it's just a basic curtain that I have built, no animation. So let's set some keyframes. Okay. So here's my basic animation. Okay. It's a little circle. Alright. So to this, I'm going to go ahead and make this a soft body. And we're going to create, make a duplicate, make it soft, and then hide the non-soft, hide the make it gold. Okay, so we'll create. Now right now, nothing's going to happen. Everything is going to be the same because we have a goal weight of 1. And let's just select this object, go in and paint our weights. And let's see, we'll set this to replace, and we'll just go here and paint this bottom set here. Alright, now let's take a look at how this reacts differently. Okay, so you see how this is reacting differently? We have this jiggle or this undulation. Alright. And that's how you can get yourself a very, very simple animation. Now let's take this a little bit further. We'll select this particle cloud and let's add a turbulence field. Alright. And we'll set the magnitude to 100, attenuation to 0, so it happens throughout the system. Okay. Let's actually set this attenuation to 5 so it kind of tapers off. Okay, just a little bit of noise there. You see how this bottom kind of chattered? Alright, but if you look, it still acts kind of funny. There's something not right about it. Well, what we need to do now is introduce something called a spring. Okay, so we'll open up the option box. And you can add to existing springs. We're not going to do that. We're going to set this to creation method to wireframe. And wire walk length, what that means is how many are of these particles that is it going to be connected to. So right now it's set to 1 each one. So what that means is when this particle moves, it's going to move its neighbor. Let's set this walk length to 2. All right. Now we can use a per spring stiffness and a per spring dampening, or we can use one stiffness and dampening for the whole thing. We'll just use one whole setup here. You see how that's trying to hold that shape? Let's play this again. Now we can increase this dampening. Now watch what happens. Okay, I'm just going to keep increasing this until we blow up the simulation. Well, it's keeping up. Now let's see if I can. What I'm trying to do is get it to where it can't keep up with what I'm trying to ask it to do. And particles will just go all over the place. Alright, so let me see if I can adjust my paint weights here. Okay. Alright, there we go. We got it to blow up there. So what's happening? Why did it do that? Well, there's too much data for the system to keep up with. So what happens is, because we made those changes in our spring and our weight, goal weight, it didn't know how to deal with that. So you're going to have to open up the solvers, edit oversampling, or cache settings. And with that, we can actually increase an oversample. Let's see, we need to modify playback speed. Alright, let's try this. You notice how it kept that animation going. Okay. Now, anytime you increase the oversampling, you're going to slow down the system big time. So keep that in mind as you're working, that you may want to reduce the some of the settings in your spring, things like your dampening and stiffness, prior to just changing the oversampling. So if the thing just kind of blows up, keep that in mind as you're working. Next, I'll talk about how to turn lattices into soft bodies. Now we're going to take a look at how to create a soft body out of a lattice. And to do so, we're going to have to alter the make soft command to reflect the original instead of the duplicate being soft. Let's take a look why. Alright, I'm going to open up the file here called lattice soft. And it's got a little cattail in here, which is a little plant. And I want this to kind of be interactive. I want it to kind of wiggle, and I want to make some air fields and some turbulence fields, and I just kind of want it to react. So let's first start by, instead of making every one of these points, which has got a lot of stuff on here, instead of making every one of those points soft, what I'm going to do is instead create a lattice around this object. And we'll have to determine if that's enough lattice points. You know, we may want to increase this. Actually, we'll leave it to 2. We'll increase it. 2 should be fine. We'll increase it to about 7. Alright, so that should give us enough movement. Now, if I was to go up here, let's see, go to make this soft, and choose duplicate, make the copy soft, the lattice will be soft, right? But the duplicate one is going to be the soft one. And the object is not connected to the duplicate object. I don't know if that makes sense. But if I choose this setting right here, I hit create. And let's just take these particles, and I got a goal weight of 0.5, and let's just add gravity. Let's watch what happens. Right? They fell. Let's lower my goal weight. See how that lattice moved down? But the cattail didn't. Right? So that tells us instantly that there is a problem with our lattice setup here. Okay, I'm actually going to get rid of all that stuff. I just need this top node here. Alright, so let's start by putting another lattice back on there. And we'll just add a few more divisions. This time, however, let's choose create soft body. Okay, I'll set this back up to 1, goal weight of 1. Duplicate, make the original soft. And we'll hit create. So what's happening is we have a duplicate lattice, and the duplicate is going to be the goal shape, right? So this is going to be just the standard lattice. And the original, which was connected to this plant, is now going to be the soft one. All right, so let's go in and select the particles. Right-click, choose particles. And let's set some per particle goals here. So I'll just select the first two up here. And my goal weight, we'll just set these to, let's say like 0.75. And the next one, we'll make them 0.8. And this one we'll say 0.9. And we'll go all the way down to this one. We'll say that's 0.95. Okay, so now let's hit play. Nothing really happens because there's no fields acting upon it. Let's go in here and select this particle. Go in here, carefully select that, and then we'll choose a turbulence field. Now this turbulence field, I'm going to crank up pretty good. Okay, so you can see here I've got my turbulence field moving. What I'm going to do is create just a polygon cube, just something to kind of hold some space. So let's imagine that this is like a truck driving by. Okay, and I'm just going to parent those together here. So I'll just move this back, parent that, move this forward, parent that. And let's take a look at what this does to our cool. Maybe we should move it back a little bit further. Okay. So now what we've got is this lattice, which is being deformed by the particle cloud, which in turn is deforming the cattail plant. So let's add one more. Let's add, let me select my particle field here. And I'm going to add an air field. And we want this pretty strong. So let's see. Set our magnitude to 250. And our direction to, let's see, -1 in X and 0. Okay, that looks pretty cool. So now let's parent this together. So I'll just shift parent. And you can see here we've got a nice little bit of rumbling. And we can actually maybe turn up the attenuation on that. I'm just going to keep lowering that attenuation. There we go. So pretty cool. And you can see here we've got one thing driving another, which in reality makes it so much easier because look, we only have a handful of particles here that we need to adjust. And in turn, we're getting a lot of good playback, getting a lot of good feedback. And we can keep layering on different fields and winds and things like that. So hopefully you can use this in one of your own projects. Just remember, when using lattices, you want to make the original soft and the duplicate the goal. We're going to now take a second to bring all of these different things that we've learned back together to create a creature that has an animation. Remember the bird that we worked on in the rigid body? Well, let's bring that bird back and let's put some jiggly parts on him, like his belly, his little feathers on his head, and then his tail feathers. And we're going to take each one a little bit differently. All right, if we open up this file here, and it's going to be the animated bird. Okay, and he's got just a real simple hop. And the whole reason he has that hop was to get some drastic movements in him so we could um, do some dynamics on him. All right, let's start off with this little feathers on his head. Always start from the beginning. Okay, I'll make these soft first. So we're going to duplicate and make the copy soft. We'll hit create. We'll paint this weights tool, and let's set this to be about 0.7 around there. So I'm just going to paint. Let me get a smaller brush here. Smaller brush like that. So let's play this. Okay, not bad. Just a little bit of movement. Okay, we're going to do the same for this one. Paint the weights, just on the tip there. Okay, make a note of this as 7, so we're going to make this one a lot springier. Okay, we'll go ahead and make that one soft. And when we paint the weights, we're going to drop this down quite a bit. Alright, so let's test this. Alright, looks good. While we have that selected, let's go ahead and add some springs. Alright, and that's going to cause some springy movement. Now, those feathers were just parented to his skull bone. So absolutely nothing, nothing out of the ordinary. Okay, just kind of a review. So I'm going to hide those springs. And now let's work on his body. Now his body has been smooth bound to the bones. So we can still make these soft. All we have to do is verify that the copy is going to be soft. All right, we do have a weight of 1. So we'll hit create. We'll go ahead and paint our skin weights, because right now if we hit play, nothing happens. Okay. But now let's go in here with a little bit of a bigger brush. And let's paint. This bird's got a nice big belly. And oops, we're actually making a big mistake here. We need to be at 0, frame 0, before we do this. Alright, we'll make it soft at frame 0. Otherwise, we're going to have some issues with the skin jumping and not moving correctly, because it's going to want to go to the goal, which was over here. Alright, now we can paint his belly. And I'm going to go pretty low, so I want it to all jiggle around here. Okay, let's just test this out. Alright, that looks pretty good. Now, if you want, you can go a little bit lower, maybe like in this core area right here. So let's play this back again. That's almost a bit too much, so let's smooth it a couple of hits. Okay. So I just added a bit to that. We'll smooth it out. Alright, that looks pretty good. Now, if you want, we have it selected, so we could just go back in and add just a little bit of movement to the wings, if you want. Make sure you get the inside of the wing here. Alright, looking good. So now we've got this creature here that's been animated. He's got quite a bit of secondary movement. Now let's deal with this tail. Okay, and I'm actually going to hide my particle cloud here. Second here. Okay. And if we look at his tail feathers, they are parented to his tail bone here. And that's not good, because I'm going to end up with lots of double transformations. So let me find this here. I'm going to move that out of this group. Group 6, it's his tail. I'm going to move it out. And actually, let me rewind it, and I'll move it out. Alright, so here's what we have. Okay, we've lost our animation. But with group 6 selected, which is the feathers, tail feathers, I'm going to jump over, add a deformer. Right, it's going to be a lattice. Okay, let's make a couple of quick modifications here. Let's go with 4 in the S, and we'll say 4 in the U. That should be more than enough. Maybe 5 in the U. Okay, that should be more than enough for us to work with. Now, this lattice is what gets parented to that tailbone. So not the feathers themselves, but instead the lattice. So let's just verify that we have movement. All right, very good. Now that we have the lattice controlling those feathers, we can easily make this our soft body. So we'll just go in here. We're going to make the original soft, create that, go into our particles, and let me jump out to our side view here. It's easier to select these particles this way. Okay, so we'll select these particles. We'll go into our component editor. And the goal for these, let's set them at 0.6. So we want a lot of jiggle here. These we'll say 0.7. Okay, these will make them 0.8. And then we'll just let these be 100%. Okay, let's take a look at our animation. Alright, and as you can see, we've got a wonderful bit of playback here. Let me turn off all my dynamics here. Just turn off the visibility. And let's just see what we have. And you notice some of it's very subtle, but like on his head, there's a nice little bit of animation right when he settles. And it's a secondary movement that you guys might want to add to your own creatures and animation settings, because a lot of times that's a little bit of magic that really finishes it out. So you could easily take this now, make that area soft, and remember, do that as a secondary animation. You know, make sure your performance is really good. Obviously here I still need a lot of movement. This is just rough, thrown together animation. But you can see just with a little bit of work where I can take some of that movement and really give it some oomph to it. So that's how you can add soft bodies to your own creatures and settings. Now that you've added soft bodies to your creature, it's time to get them ready to be rendered. And if you've ever rendered out particles, you'll always have to cache the particles so either your render farm or your motion blur settings will come out accurately. There's nothing different when working with soft bodies. You have to cache the particles. So let's, for example, select the particles on this little guy's head. Okay, and I'll show dynamics. And I hid those, so I'll just show hidden. Alright, so there's the particles. And what you'll go to is the solvers, create particle disk cache. Okay, there's the directory that you're going to create. and just hit the create button, and that will go through every frame and create particle data that can then be shared with other systems. Okay, now that that has cached, my playback is a lot slower, but I can jump through the timeline and get an accurate result of where it's going to be and at what frame it's going to be at. So now that I can save this file, send it off to get rendered, I can render it with motion blur. Everything is going to come back just fine because I do have that particle cache. And one thing to keep in mind, if you are going to render over a network using a render farm or something similar, make sure that this cache file can be read by other systems. So on your folder here, particles, make sure you give this a name that is on a network directory that can be found. In this bonus lesson, I'm going to show you a quick little lesson on how to use a fluid container to actually move geometry that's an active rigid body. All right, let's start off with a 2D container with an emitter. And let's move this emitter down. So there we go. There's our playback of particles or fluids. All right, in here, let's add a polygon sphere right there. And I'm going to make that an active rigid body. Now, one thing that we'll want to set is give it some mass. I'm going to give it a little bit of dampening. And under performance attributes, I'm going to change it from bounding box to center of mass. The reason why is the bounding box would be on the outside of the sphere, not in the center. All right, so that's an active rigid body now. Nothing really is happening, but I need to connect this object to this field. So if I go to Field, Affect Selected Objects, there we go. So we can actually move this out of the way. Let's just put it right there. And you can see there it goes, and off it goes. So pretty neat if you think about it, that you can use different fluids to push actual active rigid bodies out of the container or move them around in the container. You could easily put some constraints here so you can keep that within this area and bouncing around. So pretty cool. Now that you've gotten a 2D fluid container to move an object, let me show you how to use a 3D container to move a soft body object. Alright, let's start off with a 3D container with an emitter. And to this, I'm going to create a NURBS plane. Okay, and I'm going to adjust that plane to be 10 and 10 for U and V patches. Okay, like that. Now to this, let's go ahead and make this soft. We're going to make the copy soft, okay, with a weight of 1. There we go. Now let's go ahead and paint the weights on this. And let's see, 0.47, that's pretty good. Just move these ones in the center. Okay, we'll just hit smooth and flood that a couple times. Alright, and just like we did with the rigid body, it's really simple. All you have to do is select the particle, cloud, the fluid cloud, and the particles, and choose Fields, Affect Selected Objects. So now, as you can see here, the geometry is being bulged based off of that particle. So actually, let me move this particle up here. I'll move this down. So So we've got a little bit of an animation, and you can see how the geometry is bulging based off of that fluid. So kind of a neat way, if you had some gas or if you had like a bag that you were holding some air in, you could make some pretty cool simulations like this. I get a lot of questions about how to make footprints in wet or soft material, things like snow or sand. And it's really quite easy if you just analyze the situation. We're going to have to just make it a soft body, but the key is to keep it from undulating and resting back and forth. We're going to adjust some of the properties, things like the particles conserve. That way it conserves no energy and it leaves a footprint. Let's get started with a file that we have here called building. Okay, and in this file I have a big snow boulder that's going to fall into this pile of snow, or this ground plane of snow. So let's delete history, freeze transformations, and give this one gravity. And this snow embankment up here on this roof will do the same, but this will make passive. Okay, so let's play this. Okay, so what we want to do is create an indentation both in this surface and in this surface. Alright, so let's start with this surface down here first, and then we'll go up here and modify this one. Alright, you notice I have a lot of patches here. I've got 25 and 25 because I need it pretty dense for this thing to play back. Alright, and as you can see, it went right through the surface. So what we'll do is we'll turn this into a soft body. And our options are going to be duplicate, make copy soft. We want the non-soft object to be the goal, and we want to hide it. And let's go ahead and just set it at a weight of 1 for now. All right, and there we go. We've created our soft body. Okay, so let's play this back. As you'll see, there won't be any change because the soft body does not know to interact with these particles. So let's set that relationship up. We'll select the particles, shift select the object, and choose particles, make collide. So now you have a geoconnector. Let me see here. Let's play this back real quick. Let's just double check. Let me turn off our goal weight. So our goal weight we're going to set to like 0.3. Something real low. Alright, let's play this back. Alright, so as you can see, it does not act like snow, right? It just went right through this surface. Why is it doing that? Well, part of it is the goal, right? So if I increase the goal weight, it's going to come to rest a lot faster. Like that. So maybe that was like, you know, hot lava or something like that, where it's so dense that it just picks up and just gloops in. Let's set the goal weight to 0. Now unfortunately what's going to happen is these particles will just go forever. And that's because when that object hit that particle continued in that direction, and it'll continue forever because it's conserving all of its energy. So right up here you see where it says conserve 1. Let's drop that to like 0.5. And if you remember from the particle kit, that's one of those numbers that you only go in small increments. Well, let's go in big increments, and I'll show you what happens. So here comes our object, and it leaves a dent. Now slowly this will keep going, or that's about as far as that particle is going to go. Let's drop that to 0 so it conserves no energy. And there we go. So now if we wanted this object to bounce along here, what we'd need to do is select this object, the snow boulder, and right down at the bottom there's an object or an attribute called particle collision. Let's turn that on and see what we get now. Alright, so we shot it off, right? Way up there. Why did we shoot it off? Well, let's take a look. This has a mass of 1. Our particle cloud, each one of those little particles have a mass of 1. So let's increase the mass of this boulder to maybe something like 100. Okay, and let's go 50. It may be too heavy, and it's just pushing those particles and getting right out of the way. There we go. We're starting to get there. Let's try 25. Alright, cool. So you saw what happened. It actually hit those particles and slid and made a dent. And all that's happening automatically. Now, how much of a dent? Well, you notice it's still kind of poking through. Right? So what I like to do is instead, let's take off that particle collisions. We'll set that back to 0 for off. And let's just put in a floor. And I'll make this a passive rigid body. Now we may need to turn the bounciness of this off. Exactly. So let's give ourselves some more frames. And on this object, I'm going to go down and turn off the bounciness. I'll just say 0.1, and we'll put a dampening of 0.5. So there we go. And you can see our thing is still rolling around. Let's give it a little more dampening. We'll say 0.9. And let's put some dampening on the ball too. 0.5 on the ball, or the boulder. Perfect. Alright, so you can see here that our boulder came in and rested. Now this you can just make non-renderable. Using that technique, let's go up here and fix this object right here, because we want to do the same to this. And I'll approach that in the next lesson. If you want, try to do this on your own, where the boulder indents here, hits the ceiling, or hits the roof, and then hits the snow. Alright, we're going to continue on with the roof of the building, and we're going to go with the same setup that we did for the floor. However, we're going to take off the active rigid body of the snow that's on the roof, and then turn the roof into a passive rigid body. Alright, so let's rewind our simulation here, and let's open up the outliner. Let's see here. I'm going to delete that rigid body node. Okay, so right now the boulder will go right through the building. Alright. Now this object, I'm going to turn that into a soft body. Okay, just like I did earlier. And with the particle cloud selected, shift select the object. I'll go ahead and make collide there also. Okay, so it does go right through the object. Now this roof, I'll make it a passive rigid body because I want it to hit this and bounce. Okay, and it did what we expected, but just like with our earlier example, because this has a goal of 1, it's going to try to hold back that shape. Let's say a goal of maybe 0.5, but let's remove the conserve. Let's set that to like 0.1, so very low amount, because we want it to kind of fill back in. Actually, set the conserve to 0. Let's see what that looks like. Now, that's that goal is still trying to pull it tight. Let's try it one more time. There we go. So as you can see, we pulled off a really cool simulation pretty quickly, right? It's just a couple soft bodies and a couple of passive rigid bodies. Now, what if you wanted to have your character in snow? All you would need to do is take your character's shoes, turn them into collision objects for the particles, right? And then you'll be able to just make your character walk and push down these particles. And we'll do that in the next lesson. We'll make a little thing that will run across here. So to continue building off the snow lesson, let's make just a simple little wheel, and we'll have the wheel come across. And this could be like a tractor, a character's feet, you name it, and I'll show you how that would work. All right, I'm just going to make a polygon cylinder. Okay, let's scale that down. And we'll just get this rotated correctly. Okay, and we'll just set some keyframes here. Okay, we'll set a keyframe for rotation, and then we'll just rotate that back. So let's play this. Okay, so real simple animation here, okay? But what we'd like to do is push those particles down. Okay, and this is hand animated. It's no rigid bodies here. All I have to do is select the particles, shift select the object, particles, make collide, and then once it hits frame 100, it's going to start simulation, and as you can see, I've got tracks in the snow. Now you could do that for path animation, so if we wanted this to go along a path through here, it's really endless the way you can get this thing to work, and it's going to make some of your effects a little cooler. It's going to have that little extra oomph to them. You could easily turn this object into a soft body also, and allow it to kind of wiggle, and as it falls, it can kind of squish. So you can play with that, because once you learn this basic setup, the rest is pretty easy, and putting that together won't take you very long. I'd like to take a couple of minutes to talk to you about how to use the shatter effect. The effects are nothing more than a sequence of Mel scripts that are kind of pre-made for you, wrapped around a user interface that allow you to make some controls. I like this effect because it will go in, tear apart an object, and then get it ready for you to work with. Let's take a quick look at what we could do with the shatter effect. Alright, so I've got just a polygon sphere here, nothing fancy about the sphere. We'll go up here to Effects, Create Shatter Option Box. Now, Maya allows you to create 3 types of shatters: a surface shatter, a solid shatter, and then a crack shatter. Okay, we'll start with the surface shatter first, because it's the easiest to work with. Alright, you can give it a name if you want. You can do it later. Shard count, this tells you how many chunks it's going to break it up into. If you're going to extrude the shards and give them thickness, this is where you would set your thickness. And if you don't like what you get, you can undo it, change the seed value, which changed the randomization of it, and then run it again. And then once you like it, you can reuse that number. So without messing with any of this other stuff, let's just hit Create. It'll take it a second. And there's our original. And then here's all the pieces that it made. And it just went in and made all those up for you. So let me just throw these away and get our original back. Alright, so let me go back into our shatter plugin here. And if I do a little bit of extrude on my shards and hit apply, you notice that they extruded outward. Okay, so in other words, I ended up with a bigger sphere than when I started. If you want to go the other way, if you want the shards to go inward, use a negative amount. So let me open this up again. and I'll use a negative 0.3. And you'll see that we end up with the same size object, but now it's got thickness on the inside, as you can see there. Okay, now what's the difference between surface shatter right here and solid shatter? Well, solid shatter will actually make the object seem like it's got a thickness to it. So here's what I just did, just a default surface shatter. It does take it a second, and by default it will actually create a material for you. So if I go up here into the Hypershade, you'll see here's a shatter interior material that you can then go in and tweak. So we'll make it red. Okay, so that has an actual thickness throughout. Where earlier, when we just extruded, we gave it a thickness, but we didn't give it a core. So this would be like cutting a hole, like if you had an apple that dropped, all these pieces would be the inside of the apple, which you can then make new shaders and things like that. Alright, let me throw this away. Lastly, we'll talk about, just briefly, let me grab a polygon plane. This is good for open surfaces. So there's our polygon plane, and let me put in some more height and width. Okay, and the way this works, and you can use this for a NURBS plane too. It'll just select a point, it'll convert it to a polygon before it does the crack. But you select a point. This is where the crack is going to originate from. Go to your shatter window, go to crack shatter, and one attribute that we're going to look at right now is where it says original surface nothing. Let's change that to hide. And we'll apply this. If you take a look here, we've actually cracked from this point. We've cracked that surface. So pretty neat. What I'm going to do in the next lesson is actually walk you through what we would be able to use this for in a real production. So we'll actually create a shatter effect, and then I'll show you where an attribute is to actually turn it on and off. And when you turn it on and off, the pre-built script will hide the original and show the shattered version. So we'll get that started in just a second. Alright, now that you've had a chance to just take a look at the shatter effect, let's take a look at how we could use this in a project. Alright, let's open up the Jello Glass project. And I'm going to just go ahead and hide my grid. And I'm not going to work with this little Jello cube, so I'll just throw it away. Now what I have is a revolved surface. It's a NURBS surface. And you can work with NURBS surfaces when you shatter them. I prefer to work with polygon objects. So I'm going to go to Modify, Convert, NURBS to Polygons. Let's reset this. I want to create triangles. We'll click on General, and we'll choose per span number of isoparms, per span number of isoparms. And because this is just a demo, I'm going to set these to 2 and 2, but you may want to increase your numbers based off your the item that you're creating. Alright, so now I can just throw away the original. Alright, so there is my converted polygon object, and it's in triangles now, ready to go. So I'll just rename that glass. So let's delete history and freeze transformations. Let's give this a floor. Okay. And the floor, I'm going to give it a new material. Just something a little bit easier to see. Okay. So let's take this object now, the glass object, and we're going to convert that into a shattered object. So I'm going to stick with just a basic surface shatter, but you could use this technique for any of the others. Alright, right now we just made shapes, which means we can move them around. We don't want to leave it at just shapes. Instead, I want to turn on rigid bodies with collisions off. Now you can also go ahead and make soft bodies at this point too, but I'm going to stick with rigid bodies. Now I don't need to triangulate the surface, but I'm going to leave it on since it's going to make shards that I want to go ahead and triangulate the shards. The original surface, I'm not going to choose nothing, hide, or delete. Instead, I'm going to choose link to shards. Now when you turn that option on, notice this became active. Make the original surface rigid. So here's what's going to happen. Once I hit apply or create, it's going to take my original object, make it a rigid body, ready to be animated, okay, ready to be simulated. And then it's going to take each of those little shards and connect them to the rigid body so they'll move with the original. The thing that's amazing is it'll leave one little attribute that we can turn on and off, which will either show the shards or show the original, and we'll be able to switch it back and forth. Now verbose mode means it will just give you the display of the error message as it's pumping through the process of making this. So if you find out one object is taking a half an hour, you can turn verbose mode on and find out where it's hanging up. All right, so we'll just hit create, and we'll give it a second. And oops, it still had thickness on there, so I don't want it to extrude. Okay. So here's my object. You notice there's a little icon for the rigid body. Okay, we're set. Here is the original object. Let's take a look in our outliner. You'll notice we have the glass shape, the rigid body node, and then the surface shatter node, which has all these individual shards that make up, go to wireframe here, might be a little bit easier to see. This makes up all the little individual pieces. Alright, so let's take, and for a second here, let me move this outliner out of the way. Let's take a look at this object's top node here. And at the very bottom, you'll see in the attribute editor, as well as the channel box, it says shatter on. Okay? If I set this to 0 or off, take a look at my object. There's no shatters. Here's all the pieces. So what that attribute is doing is either, let me set that back to on. Now you see individual pieces. So the system is switching out the shards for the real object or the original object. So let me go back in here and turn shatter off. Okay, here's the original object. To that original object, we will go ahead, because it has a rigid body on there already, we'll go ahead and set the initial velocity to -10. So we'll shoot it down. Okay, we'll make the floor a passive rigid body. Okay, so it stops. I'm going to rotate this a bit. Pull it up in the air. Okay, so let's play this back. Alright, so it hit the floor and bounced. Let's make a quick modification on the floor. Right, we'll increase a little bit of dampening, decrease the bounciness. Okay, 0.2 and 0.5, bounciness 0.2, dampening 0.5. Okay, let's give this object a little bit of mass. Say 150. Okay, we're going to set the dampening on this to 1. Oh, whoops. Wrong attribute there. Bounciness to 0.1. There we go. Okay. So now, this is where we have fun with this. Because remember, on this object, we have this attribute called shatter off. So I'll animate this coming down, and right before it touches, so frame 32, I'm going to key that shatter off. Then frame 33, I'm going to key it on. And take a look at what we end up with. Oops. That's not very exciting. Let's see. We need to select the floor, go into rigid body, and see where it says collision layer. We want to set that to -1. And if you remember from earlier lessons, that means collide with all objects. And there we go. Okay, so that was a sequence of events here. And of course, each of these shards, okay, I'll just select them all, we will connect them to gravity. And if you want, you could also just go into the relationship editor, dynamic relationships, go into the actual shards themselves, and let's see, where's, oh, we haven't put gravity in here, so let's just grab all these and add them to gravity. And there we go. So that's how you can get your object to break apart using the shatter command, and you can use that with all of them. You just kind of have to do a little bit of orchestration on getting them. Now, they're not colliding with each other. Right? You notice how this is acting like this? Well, all you need to do is turn on the attribute collisions off. We'll set that to on. Now, you are going to slow this thing down. So see how it's having a little bit of a difficult time calculating this. So, and that may be something that you want to key. Oftentimes, you know, if you're breaking something apart, it moves so quick that most people won't be able to tell. So that's my 2 cents on it. If you do have an issue with collisions like this, you might want to key that attribute. So let's play this back. So maybe right there. And we'll go a frame and we'll key them on. So let's see how this reacts. So that may be an option for you if that is something that you're going to have to run into. But that's a quick and easy way of using Shatter to break apart an object. In this final lesson of the Rigid Body, Soft Body Training Kit, I want to show you how to do some dominoes, some very simple simulated dominoes. All right, we're going to start off with a blank scene here, and I'm just going to create a very quick cube here, scale it up a bit. And I'm going to add in my modeling menu set a bevel, and I'll just increase my offset a bit. So I'll just increase that. So something like this. And I'm going to rescale my object here to be a little more like a domino shape. Okay, so here's my object. Okay, that looks pretty cool. I like the little, maybe that's a little bit too much bevel on there. Let me just reduce that. Okay, we just want to catch the highlights. All right, so let's take this and delete history, freeze it, and we'll duplicate it. I'm just going to go to my top view here. Okay, and I'm just going to make the background black so it's easier to see these dominoes. Okay, so here's 1, 2. We'll make a handful of them. And I think spacing is the real key here. You want to get good spacing, just like when you have real dominoes. Okay, so just a few more here. So here's our dominoes. Okay, now let's make a floor. So I'm just going to create a NURBS plane, nothing fancy, real simple. And I'm going to put this well below. If I go into my side view here, I'm going to put this well below the floor here. Okay. And let me just add a quick material to this, just so it's a little bit easier to see those dominoes. Okay, what I'm going to do next is select all of these objects here and add gravity to them. So F4 to go into Dynamics. I'll come up to Fields, attach Gravity, which automatically made them rigid body nodes. Then in my side view and in wireframe mode, you see where the center of masses are? They're right smack dab in the middle of each domino. So if I drop these, they're gonna spin. They're not gonna tip over. So let's move their center of mass. Now you can move them right in the center. Okay. You could also cheat a little bit by moving them in Z to that corner. Now you don't have to. You can leave them down below, but I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'll show you kind of what we're going to go with and what we're going to make. All right. So if we have any problems, we'll know right away. If they try to tip over automatically, we'll need to move those center of masses back. All right. The next thing that's really important is you want to preset this animation. In that, you see how it's off the ground, right? They're hovering. Here's the ground. And that's good. We want it to hover. Because what I'll do is I'll hit play. And before I hit play, I need to make that a passive rigid body. We'll hit play, stop. Now look, now they are right there on the ground. They're perfect. They're exactly where we want them. They're all set. So what we'll do is set the initial state for all of the dynamic objects. So now when I rewind, I'm set. Everybody's ready to go. So all we need to do is select the first domino, give it an initial spin, and let's say -x. Okay. And you notice it wasn't heavy enough to tip over. So let's select all of them, and let's make a mass of something like 25. And let's reduce the bounciness to 0.2. There we go. And there's your dominoes. Now if you want, see how they slid? You can give it a little bit of dynamic friction. Maybe a little bit more like that, 0.6. Let's see how that works. So now when they hit, they stick. And, you know, obviously if you make this one heavier, the first one heavier, let's say 50, we're going to push with a little bit more force. So, you know, it's however you want to make it. But now you can, on your own, experiment with maybe this last domino hits a little object that releases a spring, and then when the ball lands, it hits a soft body, rolls, and hits another domino, and it starts it off. You could have a lot of fun with this. It's going to end up with how powerful your system is, and it might be fun bragging to say, you know, I had 10,000 dominoes cruising along making a pattern. But I hope you enjoyed this rigid body and soft body training kit. As always, thank you for being a customer of Digital Tutors and supporting one of the fastest growing training websites and services on the net. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you in the next training module.